Well, Jesus asked really a question for the disciples that had gathered around to listen after his sermon last week that we talked about last week, that just a few verses back. Are we listening? Jesus, after those verses of blessing and warning of woes that he issued, Jesus checks in again. I say to you who are listening. So many distractions. I'm sure there were probably distractions in their day and time too, just like there are ours. Sometimes you know how hard it is just to focus on something these days? Between the busyness of work or things that need to be done around the house or the impending news source that's coming into your house or, whatever's bothering and worrying and concerning us, sometimes that's so hard to set aside just to be able to listen to what God's saying. In fact, there's times an instance where, they ask, where's God in the midst of this? Was it God in the earthquake? No. Was God in the mighty, vicious wind? No. Was it in the violent storm? But it was in the small, still voice. Sometimes it's hard for us to hear in the busyness of the world. But for those of us who are listening, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Pray for those who mistreat you. What in the world are you talking about? And if you want more reference from Different Strokes, what in the world are you talking about? What you talking about, Willis? I know, there's an old joke between some of us going on about Different Strokes reruns. But what are you talking about? Love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, pray for those who mistreat you. Our human nature is to say, not interested in that. Those are reactions that are really not normal, especially in our way of life in the 21st century. I'm not doing that. It's really counter to everything that is human nature. The old growing up, well, don't you hit them first, but if they hit you, hit them back. See? I knew you knew this. That's not the way the world works, especially these days, it seems, where everything is some kind of an exchange, this for that. Say, perhaps, if you needed a more concrete example, that we will help fight an invasion of an outside power if we get minimal rights, if you need an example. But it's a gut reaction. It really is that flight or fight part of our brains, that reptile part. It's the driving force of our reactions committed to the most basic necessity part of life. Our breathing, our heart, pulse, that part that happens way down deep in the brain that we can't control, which is good for a lot of us on a lot of days. And yet that'll fix it. The hard truth and reaction, and that's the normal way that we live our lives. You do this to me, I'm going to do this to you. What is it the old saying goes? An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and the whole world is blind and toothless. That's how it gets. That's what it gets. But Jesus' way, and you know this, is different than the normal way, at least for those who are listening. Maybe that might need to be reiterated even more in our mind and our hearing of this text again. There's a whole section of stuff, and Jesus has been preaching about, blessed are, woe you who are full now. Woe to you who laugh. Woe to you who's got it so good. He's already said all that. And then he's like, but to those who are listening, it's like somebody's already tuned out already, working on the grocery list. But those who are listening, just as this is a season of Epiphany that we're in, it helps us to see and to know who Jesus is for the world and for us. Jesus continues to be revealed to us. It doesn't matter if we're new on the faith journey or we've been on it 1,000,000 years. It means just to see just a little bit more of who God is through Jesus, hearing Jesus' story and the revelation of who God is through Jesus for the world, for all the world, not just for some of it. Especially in the Gospel of Luke, this is so important because there's so many people that Luke is writing to that are so important, the high and the mighty of the culture and the society. And Jesus says, blessed are the poor. Blessed are those who are weak, not mighty. I mean, the implication, it's a this or that. But in the Gospel of Luke, it's upside down, things change. There's a transformation that's occurring over and over again, and there's a higher calling and living because of Jesus. If they strike a cheek, you are to offer the other. If they take your coat, give them your shirt also. See, y'all know this. I don't even know why I'm talking about it today, because y'all already know it. But the Lord knows the world doesn't do it. And it's hard for me to do it a lot of times too. I'll admit that. Maybe I'm preaching to the preacher first. It's counter to every practice and norm of our culture. Even after Jesus' teaching has been around for 2,000 years, you would think, even for the slow learners, that 2,000 years would do it. And yet the world, day in and day out life, and our lives don't prove that. Someone does something nice for you, and you do something nice for them. What credit is that for you? Oh, well, they invited me out to lunch. I'm going to invite them to lunch. You know how that goes. I mean, if they can pay you back, it's really not the Christian way or the Christian way of living necessarily. I mean, I'm not saying don't invite people to lunch. It's a good thing. Fellowship around the table is always the presence of Christ. So, I'm not saying don't do that. But don't keep track, score, and record. Oh, you did this to me 45 years ago, and I'm going to hold it against you forever and ever and always. I say that with a funny voice, and I probably shouldn't, because that's very serious for us. Sometimes even that attempt to forgive is so hard. It's something about that frustration and that anger and that vice to hold that grudge in our hearts and in our mind. It doesn't really do anything for the other person because they've already probably forgotten it 100 years ago. And you're the one that lets it eat away at your soul. Part of that for our joyful living is to give that offer up to Christ. Let it go. One of my professors said, you don't have to forget it. Remember it, but don't set yourself up for the same experience over and over again. That's not joyful living. That's not abundant life. That's not Jesus being in the midst of you and your life. Let it go, because you're the one that's being dragged down by it. I'm the one that's being dragged down by it. We are drugged down by holding on to that. Not what Jesus is wanting. Tit for tat. Doesn't work. Jesus is much more complicated. Jesus' way is much more complicated, and it's much more troublesome for us because it's counter to everything we know. Everything that makes sense, the reflection of the world and successes that we have around us, doesn't go like this. Jesus teaches us to love our enemies, to do good, and to lend, even if they can't pay us back, expecting nothing in return. Why in the absolute world does that make any sense to any of us? Because Jesus did and does that for us. We are loved before we even know it, prevenient grace acting in our life even before we realize that we even need God's grace. God's grace and God's love is there present in our life, offering to us that love, that mercy, and that forgiveness. That's the only way that we can get through life, is our dependence upon Christ. That's the difference it makes. That we are loved before we even know that we need God's love. That we are loved despite our wants to return it tit for tat, keeping some kind of score. Lord, if you help me find a parking spot, I will always praise you. It's not how it works. There's plenty of scriptural evidence for that. The rain falls on the just and the unjust. Makes no sense sometimes the way things are, but it also reminds us over and over again that we are loved by Christ. We're loved by God to be God's people in the world. We are loved not because we deserve it or that we've earned it. There's absolutely, positively nothing that we can do to get it. Because we can't do either. We can't deserve it and we can't earn it. The kindness and love of Christ that we have received, the grace and the mercy that we are recipients of, is Christ's gifts alone to us, offered without price. It's just our opportunity to accept it for our lives and to depend on it for God's grace and stability and courage and wisdom and strength and all that we are, the undergirding light and love that is in our lives. We have received enough love, a hope not to mistreat others or reflect the ways of the world in our life, because we have experienced Christ's love and gift to us. If you want somebody that's probably a bit more eloquent and a bit more referred to, if we think about Dietrich Bonhoeffer's in The Cost of Discipleship, he puts it this way: this commitment that we should love our enemies and forego revenge will grow even more urgent in the holy struggle which lies before us, and in which we partly have already been engaged for years. In it, love and hate engage in moral combat. It is the urgent duty of every Christian soul to prepare itself for it. And how is this battle to be fought? Soon the time will come when we shall pray, not as isolated individuals, but as a corporate body, a congregation, a church. We shall pray in multitudes, albeit in relatively small multitudes, and among the thousands and thousands of apostates we shall loudly praise and confess the Lord, who was crucified and is risen, and shall come again. And what prayer, what confession, what hymn of praise will it be? It will be the prayer of earnest love for these very sons of perdition who stand around and gaze at us with eyes aflame with hatred, and who have perhaps already raised their hands to kill us. It will be prayer for the peace of those erring, devastated, and bewildering souls, a prayer for the same love and peace which we ourselves enjoy, a prayer which will penetrate to the depths of their souls and rend their hearts more grievously than anything they can do to us. The very power of Christ alive in our life and in the world changes things. It isn't how we expect it. It's not how we think it should be. It is God's love that permeates and penetrates and changes the world around us. And it's we as followers of Christ, the people of Christ that go forth into the world, we're to offer that same light and love with all that we do. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, to the one who was and who is to come, be all glory, honor, and praise.